It was a little after midnight on the 8th of December 2024 when the Lenoir County Sheriff's Office received a call that shattered the silence of the night. The voice on the other end was frantic, gasping between words, struggling to explain what had just happened. A man had been shot. He wasn't breathing. There was blood. The panic in the caller's voice painted the picture of a home under siege, a family thrown into chaos by an act of unthinkable violence. The woman on the line was 26-year-old Nija Perkins. She claimed she had been in bed when she heard the gunshots. Fear gripping her, she said she grabbed her children, hid them beneath the bed, and waited for the nightmare to pass. But when the chaos settled and she stepped into the living room, she found her boyfriend, 30-year-old Quenton Lee Gray, lying motionless, his body riddled with bullets. She had no idea who did it, no idea where they went, just that the man she loved was now gone. Deputies arrived within minutes. The scene before them was chilling. Quenton was on the floor, blood pooling beneath him, his two young sons still inside the house, too young to understand the gravity of what had just unfolded. The evidence suggested a violent home invasion, a robbery that had turned deadly. But as officers surveyed the crime scene, questions began to form. There were no broken windows, no forced entry, nothing to suggest a stranger had forced their way in. The doors were intact, the house undisturbed, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. It was the first indication that this crime was not what it seemed. As investigators combed through the evidence, inconsistencies in Nija's story began to emerge. Her demeanor, her words, the way she carried herself, it didn't align with the horror she claimed to have witnessed. And then came the biggest revelation of all. Just weeks later, police made a stunning announcement. The grieving girlfriend wasn't a victim at all. She was a suspect. And she wasn't alone. Another name surfaced, a man with his own troubled past, a co-worker who had no business being connected to Quenton's murder. The two were arrested on charges of first-degree murder, accused of planning and executing a crime that left a father dead and two young boys without their father. What really happened inside that house on Sweet Amy Lane? What pushed Nija Perkins and her co-worker, 29-year-old Calvin Coley, to commit a crime so cold, so calculated that it fooled everyone, at least for a little while? As the truth unraveled, it became clear that this was never a random act of violence. It was something else entirely. Stay with us as we uncover the tangled web of deception, betrayal, and premeditated murder that shocked Lenoir County, North Carolina. Quenton Lee Gray was a man with dreams too big for the place he called home. At 30 years old, he had spent his life navigating the quiet, tight-knit community of LaGrange, North Carolina. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where reputations followed you for life, and opportunities often felt just out of reach. But Quenton was determined to carve out something more, not just for himself, but for the two little boys who looked up to him. To his friends, he was Hoodrich Montana, an up-and-coming rapper who believed his talent could take him beyond the city limits. Music was his escape, his passion, the thing that kept him grinding through long nights in the studio, hoping that one day his lyrics would be more than just words, hoping they would be his way out. He wasn't a man chasing fame for its own sake. For Quenton, music wasn't about money or status. It was about creating a future, something his sons, Johnny and Amiri, could be proud of. To the world outside, he was the guy making music, the artist who poured his life into his lyrics. But to those who knew him best, Quenton was more than that. He was a father first, the kind of man who never missed a birthday, who made sure his boys had what they needed, even when times were tough. His friends would say that if you spent 5 minutes with Quenton, you'd hear him talk about his kids. He wasn't just present in their lives, he was their world. And that's what made what happened next even harder to accept. He had built a home with Nija Perkins, the woman he had been with for years, the mother of his children. From the outside, they were a family like any other. Social media showed smiling photos, loving captions, and moments that seemed frozen in happiness. Nija spoke about Quenton with admiration, calling him her everything, sharing glimpses of their life together. They looked like a couple that had it all: love, family, and a future ahead of them. But photographs don't tell the whole story, and the reality behind closed doors was something else entirely. People close to Quenton knew that things between him and Nija weren't perfect. There were arguments, tension that built in small, quiet moments. He was focused on his music and his children, working toward a future that sometimes felt just out of reach. But there were things that weren't being said, glances that held more than words, emotions that simmered beneath the surface. Some say he tried to hold it all together, that he stayed in the relationship for his sons, that he believed commitment meant working through the hard times. But what happens when one person is fighting to hold on while the other is planning to let go? In the weeks before his murder, Quenton seemed like a man focused on the future. He had goals, plans, things he wanted to accomplish. He was trying to break into the music industry, to find that one opportunity that would change everything. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that a plan had already been set in motion, one that had nothing to do with his dreams, his music, or his future. In the days leading up to his death, something shifted. There were whispers, conversations he wasn't privy to, a presence in his life that shouldn't have been there. And on the night of December 8, 2024, everything came to an end. The police would later say there was no sign of forced entry, no struggle, nothing to indicate that Quenton had been caught off guard. Which raised the question, who had he trusted enough to let into his home that night? And more importantly, why did that trust cost him his life? Those who knew Quenton struggled to make sense of it. How does a father, a man devoted to his children, end up lying lifeless on the floor of his own home? How does a relationship built over years suddenly turn into something so deadly? There were too many questions, too many loose ends. The woman who once called him her everything now stood accused of playing a role in his murder. And she wasn't alone. The name of another man, one Quenton had no connection to, was suddenly tied to his death. The investigation was just beginning, and what detectives were about to uncover would leave an entire community in shock. Who was Calvin Coley? What role did he play in Quenton's final moment? And how did a relationship that once seemed so picture-perfect lead to such a brutal and calculated crime? December 8, 2024, a quiet night in Lenoir County, the kind where most people had already settled into bed, where the hum of the wind outside and the occasional passing car were the only sounds breaking the silence. Nothing seemed out of place on Sweet Amy Lane, no disturbances, no warning signs, just another night in a town where crime, especially of this magnitude, was rare. Then, sometime after midnight, the silence was shattered by gunfire. A rapid succession of shots rang out inside the single-story home where 30-year-old Quenton Lee Gray lived with his girlfriend Nija Perkins and their 2 young sons. A neighbor, startled by the noise, later recalled lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting to hear if it was just fireworks or something far worse. But no one called the police. The night remained still, and for a brief moment, it was as if nothing had happened at all. Then at 12:28 a.m., the Lenoir County Sheriff's Office received a frantic 911 call. On the other end was Nija Perkins, her voice unsteady, breathless, words spilling out between gasps. She told the dispatcher she had been asleep when she heard gunshots. Terrified, she claimed she grabbed her children and hid them under the bed, praying that whoever was inside the house wouldn't find them. When she finally emerged from the bedroom, she said, she saw Quenton lying in the living room, unresponsive, bleeding. Her voice wavered as she answered the dispatcher's questions. Was he breathing? No, I don't think so. How long ago did this happen? 5 minutes ago. How many suspects were involved? I don't know, sir. She sounded panicked, uncertain. But there was something about the call, something in her tone, her pauses, that didn't sit right. Deputies were dispatched immediately. They arrived within minutes, their vehicles pulling up to the modest house, red and blue lights flashing against the darkened street. When they stepped inside, the first thing they saw was Quenton's lifeless body sprawled on the floor of the living room, his blood seeping into the carpet beneath him. He had been shot multiple times, too many times for this to be a random break-in gone wrong. His 2 sons, still inside the home, had witnessed their father's final moments. They were too young to understand the depth of what had just happened, but old enough to know that something was terribly wrong. Deputies carefully escorted them out of the house, shielding them from the scene that no child should ever have to witness. Then came the first red flag. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged locks, no kicked-in doors. Whoever pulled the trigger had walked inside without a struggle. Either Quenton had let them in himself, or they had already been inside when he was shot. Investigators began working through the scene, noting what was missing just as much as what was there. Nothing appeared stolen, no drawers ransacked, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, none of the typical signs of a robbery. If this was a home invasion, why had nothing been taken? Why had only Quenton been targeted? Then they turned to Nija Perkins. She stood outside, arms wrapped around herself, rocking back and forth as she answered their questions. Her story remained the same. She had been in bed, she heard gunshots, she hid with the kids. She didn't see who did it, she didn't know why. But something was off. Officers noted that while she appeared distressed, there was an odd detachment in her demeanor. She wasn't asking questions about Quenton, she wasn't pressing for answers. She wasn't the frantic, grief-stricken girlfriend they expected to see. And when she described what had happened, she left out details that any eyewitness, especially someone who had just lost a loved one, would normally provide. One detective would later say that from the moment they arrived, something about her story felt incomplete. There were too many gaps, too many convenient unknowns. And then came another glaring inconsistency: the positioning of Quenton's body. Quenton had been shot multiple times, yet there were no clear signs of a struggle. His body wasn't slumped as if he had fallen mid-run. Instead, he lay face down in a way that seemed unnatural, almost deliberate. His injuries suggested he had been shot at close range. This wasn't the chaotic aftermath of a home invasion gone wrong. It was controlled, precise. Then there was the 911 call itself. When officers reviewed it, they noticed something odd. When the dispatcher asked Nija where Quenton had been shot, she hesitated. Not just for a moment, but long enough that it stood out. She didn't check. She didn't even seem to know, despite claiming to have seen his body before making the call. How could she not know where he was shot if she had been the one to find him? And then there was her social media activity. In the hours following Quenton's death, Nija took to Facebook, posting messages filled with grief and heartbreak. "I love you. Thank you for everything. Me, Gianni, and Amiri love you." The post quickly gained attention, flooded with condolences from friends, family, and Quenton's supporters. To most, it seemed like the mourning of a devastated girlfriend. But just 2 days later, her tone changed, drastically. She was no longer the grieving partner, she was in control. "Everybody that think they gonna be at Hoodrich, Montana's service, y'all not. He only fed with a few and they know who they are." It was a shift that didn't go unnoticed. People who had once offered condolences were now raising questions. Why was she dictating who could attend the funeral? Why did she sound more defensive than heartbroken? And why was she so quick to take control of the narrative? Quenton's family had questions, but they weren't the only ones. Law enforcement had already started to pull apart the inconsistencies in Nija's story. The missing evidence, the forced sorrow, the lack of forced entry, and as they dug deeper, one name kept coming up. One that didn't belong in Quenton's world. Calvin Coley, a co-worker of Nija's, a man with a criminal past, a man who had been arrested before for attempted murder. Why was his name surfacing in the middle of a homicide investigation? What was his connection to Quenton? And why, just weeks later, would both he and Nija be taken into custody, charged with first-degree murder? The truth was starting to take shape, and it was nothing like what Nija had claimed. What had detectives uncovered? How was a man Quenton barely knew connected to his death? And what role did Nija really play in the crime? When the first officers arrived at the home on Sweet Amy Lane, they had every reason to believe they were walking into a tragic but straightforward case. A home invasion, a robbery that had gone too far, a grieving girlfriend still shaken from the horror of watching the father of her children die in front of her. But as the minutes ticked by, something wasn't right. Investigators began their work the way they always did, by breaking the scene down piece by piece. They noted where Quenton's body had fallen, the unnatural position he was in, the pattern of blood pooling beneath him. They examined the locks, the windows, the doors. Nothing had been tampered with, not a single forced entry point. That meant whoever pulled the trigger hadn't broken in, they had been let in. That was the first red flag. The second came when officers began questioning Nija Perkins. Her story remained consistent, too consistent. She repeated the same details over and over, but something about the way she spoke felt rehearsed. Her grief didn't come in waves. There were no moments where she lost her composure, no sudden emotions breaking through. It was controlled. And then there was the 911 call. When detectives listened back to it, one moment stood out. The operator had asked a critical question: where was he shot? And there had been a pause, a long, noticeable hesitation before she finally responded, "I don't know." How could she not know? She claimed she had gone into the living room. She had said she saw him lying there, lifeless, covered in blood. How could she see all of that but not know where the bullets had struck? That was the moment suspicion shifted from possibility to certainty. This wasn't just a grieving girlfriend caught in the aftermath of a horrific crime. This was someone who wasn't telling the full truth. Detectives took a step back and started looking at the bigger picture. Quenton wasn't the kind of man to have enemies lurking in the shadows. He wasn't tied to gangs, wasn't wrapped up in illegal dealings. He was focused on two things: his music and his kids. So if this wasn't a robbery and it wasn't a random attack, then the real question was, who stood to benefit from his death? The answer would come from an unlikely source, Nija's phone records. When investigators pulled her call logs, they found something that changed everything. In the hours before Quenton's murder, Nija had been in contact with someone, a man Quenton barely knew, a man who had no business being involved in his life. A name surfaced, Calvin Coley. The name meant nothing to Quenton's closest friends. They had never heard of him. As far as they knew, Quenton and Calvin had no connection. But when detectives ran the name, they realized that was only half the story. Calvin Coley was Nija's co-worker, a 29-year-old from Goldsboro, a man with a violent past. Just 4 years earlier, in March of 2020, Calvin had been arrested for a shooting that left 4 people injured. He had been charged with attempted murder and firing into an occupied dwelling, the kind of crime that didn't happen by accident. Calvin wasn't some innocent bystander. He was a man who had pulled the trigger before. And now he was suddenly connected to another murder? What? Detectives began tracing Nija and Calvin's relationship. They worked together. They had known each other for months. But their conversations weren't just about work. The frequency of their messages, especially in the days leading up to Quenton's murder, suggested that this was more than just a casual friendship. Was this about money? Was this about a relationship? Or was it something even deeper? And then, investigators uncovered another damning piece of evidence. After Quenton was shot, Nija had made another call. Not to family, not to friends. She had called Calvin Coley. Within minutes of the murder, she had reached out to the one person who shouldn't have been involved at all. That's when investigators stopped looking at Nija as a grieving girlfriend and started looking at her as a suspect. For weeks, detectives built their case. They tracked phone records, they examined surveillance footage, they dug into financial transactions, and by January 15, 2025, they were ready. At her workplace in Quenton, North Carolina, Nija Perkins was arrested. She had no time to react, no warning that the walls had finally closed in. One moment she was at work, the next she was in handcuffs, being escorted to a police cruiser under the weight of a first-degree murder charge. Across town, officers moved in on Calvin Coley. Unlike Nija, he didn't come quietly. When police arrived at his job, he tried to run. He slipped into a storage area, attempting to disappear behind pallets of inventory. But detectives were already there. They cut off every exit, cornered him, and within minutes he was on the ground, his hands cuffed behind his back. 2 arrests, 2 charges of first-degree murder, and one question that still hadn't been answered. Why? Why would a woman who had spent years with Quenton, who had his children, who posted about him like he was her world, conspire to have him killed? Why was Calvin willing to pull the trigger? Was this about love, jealousy, money, or something even more calculated? The truth was about to come out. And when it did, it would shake Lenoir County to its core. By the morning of January 16, 2025, the case had already gripped Lenoir County. News of Nija Perkins and Calvin Coley's arrests spread fast, rippling through the community, sparking debates, theories, and outrage. But as the courtroom doors opened, it wasn't just the locals watching. This case had drawn attention beyond North Carolina. Inside, the air was heavy. Reporters lined the back rows, whispering among themselves, notebooks ready. Family members filled the seats, their faces tense, their hands gripping the edges of benches as they waited for the proceedings to begin. The presence of Quenton's loved ones was unmistakable. His mother sat near the front, eyes red-rimmed but locked forward, refusing to look at the woman who once stood beside her son. His friends, men who had grown up with him, sat rigid, their expressions unreadable. At 9 a.m. sharp, the side door opened. The sound of shackles clinking against the polished floor sent a wave of murmurs through the room. Nija Perkins walked in first. Her face was blank, not grief-stricken, not defiant, just empty. She wore the same orange jumpsuit as the man who followed behind her, Calvin Coley. He barely looked up, his eyes fixed on the ground. The courtroom quieted as the judge took the bench. Then came the moment that everyone had been waiting for. The charges? The prosecutor's voice was steady, unwavering. Nija Perkins and Calvin Coley, you are charged with first-degree murder and felony conspiracy in the death of Quenton Lee Gray. If convicted, you face life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For a moment, the entire room felt frozen in place. The weight of those words settled over everyone. Life. No second chances, no way out. But what everyone wanted to know, what people had been speculating about for weeks, was how Nija and Calvin would respond. Would she cry? Would she plead her innocence? Would she try to explain away the evidence? The judge turned to Nija first. "How do you plead?" She shifted slightly but didn't hesitate. "Not guilty." Then Calvin's turn, the same question, the same response. "Not guilty?" A low murmur spread through the room. Not guilty. Despite the phone records, despite the surveillance footage, despite everything investigators had uncovered. If they weren't going to confess, then this case was about to become a battle. The district attorney wasted no time. As the trial moved forward, they laid out every damning piece of evidence. The 911 call, the hesitation, the lack of urgency, the missing details that any truly panicked person would have provided. The lack of forced entry, there was no break-in, no struggle. Quenton hadn't been ambushed by a stranger. He had been caught off guard, likely by someone he trusted. The phone records, the constant communication between Nija and Calvin before the murder, the call Nija made to Calvin minutes after Quenton was shot. The forensic evidence, gunpowder residue, angles of the shots, the position of Quenton's body, everything pointed to a controlled, deliberate killing. The surveillance footage, the fact that there were no unidentified suspects seen fleeing the area, no strange cars, no masked intruders, just Nija, her children, and Quenton, until the moment he was gone. Every detail painted the same picture. This was a setup, a plan, a crime committed by someone who wasn't acting alone. If Nija and Calvin expected their attorneys to explain away the evidence, they were mistaken. The defense had little to say. No alternate theory, no claims of mistaken identity, no real counter-argument to what prosecutors had laid out. Nija's lawyer argued that she was simply a grieving girlfriend caught in a terrible situation, that her phone calls to Calvin were coincidental, that she had no motive to kill Quenton. But the prosecutor shut that down quickly. If Nija Perkins was nothing more than a grieving girlfriend, then why was she calling Calvin Cully before and after the murder? Why was her story inconsistent? Why was Quenton killed in such a controlled, deliberate manner inside his own home? And why was Nija the only person in that house that night who wasn't a victim? There was no answer. Calvin's defense was even weaker. His lawyer tried to distance him from the crime entirely, claiming there was no proof he was there that night. Again, the prosecution struck back. Then why did he run when police came for him? Why did his phone ping near Nija's home on the night of the murder? Why did he try to hide from officers when they tracked him down? Again, no answer. The most powerful moments in the courtroom came when Quenton's family took the stand. His mother's voice broke as she spoke about the night she got the call, about the way she collapsed to the floor when she heard her son was gone, about the moment she realized his two young children would grow up without their father. His best friend spoke next, describing Quenton as a man who never turned his back on the people he loved, a man who spent his days working, rapping, and raising his kids, never suspecting that the person sleeping beside him had already made a decision that would end his life.
A woman who deputies say made a 911 call last month has been charged with her boyfriend's murder. The Lenoir County Sheriff's Office says Nyasia Perkins and Calvin Colley were arrested Wednesday and charged with first-degree murder and felony conspiracy in Quenton Gray's death. Deputies say both Perkins and Colley were arrested yesterday at their places of work in Kinston. Deputies won't say where that happened, but did confirm the two worked together. The 26-year-old woman lives in Lenoir County, while deputies say the 29-year-old man is from Goldsboro. And just after midnight on December 8th, deputies say they were called to a home on Sweet Amy Lane for reports of someone being shot during a breaking and entering. Their 30-year-old Gray was found shot to death in his living room. The sheriff's office says Perkins also lived at the home with Gray, and deputies say she made the 911 call reporting the shooting. Deputies say there were two small children along with the man's girlfriend in the home when the shooting happened. Perkins and Coley are being held in the Lenoir County Jail without bond.
Then came the most haunting words of all. "I sat next to Nija at the funeral," Quenton's cousin told the jury. "I watched her cry. I hugged her, and the whole time she knew she was the reason he was in that casket." It was a statement that left the courtroom silent. As the trial reached its final moments, there was only one question left. Would the jury see through the lies? Would they deliver justice for Quenton? Or was there one more twist still waiting to unfold? The verdict was coming, and the truth would soon be sealed forever. The verdict was in. The courtroom had spoken. The weight of justice had fallen on Nija Perkins and Calvin Colley, sealing their fate, closing a chapter that had left an entire community stunned. But long after the gavel dropped and the news crews packed up, the deeper questions still lingered. This case was not just about a murder, it was about betrayal at its most calculated form. It was about a man who trusted the wrong person, a woman who had once vowed to stand by him but instead conspired to see him buried, and it was about the unseen dangers of relationships that turn toxic in the most irreversible way. What drives a person to plot the murder of someone they once loved? In the weeks following the trial, the conversations weren't just about guilt or innocence, they were about why. Why would a woman with whom Quenton had built a life, a home, a family, 2 children, decide that taking his life was the only way forward? Why involve another man, someone with no real connection to Quenton, to carry out such an act? And if love, jealousy, or revenge were at the center of it all, when did that shift happen? When did the person who once called Quenton her everything decide he was no longer worth keeping alive? 2 little boys lost their father, their protector, their source of comfort. They were inside that house the night he was killed. They heard the gunshots, they were there. And now, they had lost their mother, too. It's easy to talk about cases like these in terms of headlines, in terms of courtrooms and verdicts. But there's a real cost to violence like this. Quenton's sons will grow up knowing that the person who was supposed to love their father the most was responsible for his death. How do you explain that to a child? How do you erase the memory of hearing gunfire in the middle of the night, of stepping into the living room and seeing something no child should ever have to see? These children will grow up with questions that no one will ever be able to answer completely. They will grow up with a hole in their lives where their father should have been, and at some point, they will learn the full truth. If there's one thing this case reminds us, it's that danger doesn't always come from the outside. It doesn't always arrive in the form of a masked intruder or a stranger in the dark. Sometimes the greatest threat is already inside the house. Quenton likely never saw it coming. The person responsible for his death wasn't a random enemy, it wasn't a rival, wasn't someone seeking revenge over a personal dispute. It was the mother of his children, the person he shared his home with, the person he trusted to be by his side. How does someone spot a betrayal before it happens? Are there warning signs? Small shifts in behavior? Did Quenton sense that something was wrong? Did he ever suspect that the person sleeping beside him was plotting his murder? Or did he believe until the very last second that he was safe in his own home? It's a chilling thought, because if Quenton didn't see it coming, how many others could find themselves in the same situation, unaware that the greatest threat to their life isn't outside their door, but already inside? The case of Quenton Lee Gray shook Lenoir County in ways few could have expected. It wasn't just about the murder itself, it was about the betrayal, the deception, the cold calculation behind it all. Could it have been prevented? Could someone have warned Quenton before it was too late? And how many more stories like his exist unfolding right now, in households where love has turned into something dangerous? This wasn't just another crime. This was a reminder that trust is fragile, that love can sometimes be the thing that blinds people to danger, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life isn't the one breaking in through the window. It's the one standing right beside you. If you were shocked by this case, if Quenton's story resonated with you, then we need your help to grow Explosive True Crime Story. Like this video to help more people see it, so that no one misses the lessons buried in this tragedy. Comment below and tell us, do you think justice was truly served? Were there warning signs? And how do we stop cases like this from happening again? Share this video with your friends and family. The more people who know about these crimes, the more conversations we start, and awareness can save lives. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We cover real stories, real crimes, and real victims, because the truth isn't always what it seems, and the next story we tell might be the one that changes everything.